Okay, we're talking about the two-step method for tax, tip, discount, markdown, all of those kinds of things. I want to talk about how it's different from the one-step method. We've been doing the one-step method with these tape diagrams, and it works really well when you just have one increase or one decrease. For example, if I went out to eat, and this is how much my bill costs, let's say it costs $50, and I wanted to leave a tip, and I didn't have any tax on it, that's just one increase, right? So I would say, let's leave a 20% tip on $100 or on $50. I could leave that here, and what I did is I said, well, since I had 100% at first, I want to leave a 20% tip, so now I'm actually going to leave 120% total. And that's what we did at the one-step method, and that works really well if you only have one increase. But what happens if you have a tax? So let's think about, let me see if I can get that to focus a little better. Let's think about a tax on top of this. So we have our $50 bill, and we want to leave a 20% tip, okay? Now, what I know, because I'm going to do those in my head really quick, is that means that this is a $10 tip. So it's a $50 bill for the meal plus a $10 tip. Now, I don't actually have to pay taxes on that $10. I don't want to pay taxes on $60. I only want to pay taxes on $50. So what we have to do is we actually have to do this in two steps where we calculate just the tip, we calculate just the tax, and then we add them together. And so the thing we need to remember is that we always tip on the bill and we always tax on the bill, not on the bill plus tax. Okay? So we always tip and tax off of just what our final bill is. Now it gets a little complicated when we get to discounts. So same kind of thing here. Let's say we had a decrease and our bill was $50, and let's say that this is a restaurant that gave us a really amazing coupon, 50% off. So we're really only paying $25. Do you think it's fair to give the waitress a tip only on $25? No, we should give her a tip on the whole $50, right? So we always tip on whatever the original bill was. But we tax on what the final bill was after a discount. So we'll look at how to do that here in a second. So now that I've thoroughly confused you, let me just show you how to do this. So the first thing we're always going to do when we're using the two-step method is we are going to do a little setup for our final answer. So this isn't one of those things that is absolutely necessary. You have to do this or you will definitely get it wrong, but this is just handy. I like to draw a little table, and I like to use this table to help me just organize my thoughts. Because what I find is a lot of times we just get lost in the math and we just don't know what numbers are what, and so we kind of just get confused. So the first thing we're going to do in this table is we're going to figure out what we start with. We can sometimes call that a subtotal. We can sometimes call that starting, original bill, lots of different things. And of course down here is going to be our total, what our final bill is. That's what we finally pay in the very end. And then this table helps us look at whether we have markups, markdowns, increases, decreases. We're going to put them here, so we'll have one line for each of those. So here's an example that I had where we did the one-step method before. Something cost a store $99.50, and they wanted to do a 95% markup on it. So we've done this actually on our one-step method. We actually did this right here. See, we did, so 99%, 99.50, 95% markup. So what we did is we said, oh, if I started with 100% and I added 95, I end with 195. And so we just did it in one big giant step where we said, all right, then I'm calculating 195% is where I'm actually ending. But this time what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, 100% is 99.50. What is 95%? And then we're going to add those two together. We're going to add the 99.50 and the 95% together to get our total amount. Okay? So we set up our final answer, and that's the first thing you need to do. Now what you're going to do is you're going to calculate the value that you add or subtract. So this again, in our one-step method, we were calculating what percent we were adding and subtracting the percents. Now we're actually going to figure out how much actual money or whatever are we actually adding in. Okay, so the question here then is, what is 95% of 99.50? That's what we're asking ourselves. What's 95% of 99.50? Because remember, we start with 99.50, and we need to add in whatever 95% of that is. So we have to calculate 95% of 99.50. Okay, so there's a couple ways we can do this. We'll do both of them. So remember, the first way is we can set up a proportion. When we want to find 95% of any number, we set up a proportion with 95 over 100, because that's what 95% would be. We don't know what our final value is, but we know we're starting with 99.50. So we can cross multiply and divide this, and we would get 94.525, which turns into 94.53. So that's one way. Remember, the other way to calculate 95% of anything is to take the number we're starting with. I'll do this in this color. 99.50. And we multiply it by the percent we're trying to calculate. And in this case, we're trying to calculate 95%. But remember, we turned that into a decimal. So we do 95% of 99.50, just like that. Okay, and we multiply those two together, and we get the same number, 94.525. So remember, either way, you can just, if you have an original and a percent, you can just multiply those two together, or you can set up the proportion. But in the end, what we found is our markup is 94.553. So we're going to say plus our markup. Okay, so that's how we write that. We say, all right, we started with this amount, we added our markup. So what is our total? Our total, well, we just add those two together, and we get 194.03. So I didn't write the other two steps. The other steps are put the value in the table, add or subtract to find the total. So let's look at some more examples. So if I buy a bicycle that's $189.50, and I'm going to do 5% tax on it, let's figure out how much I'm going to actually pay for that bicycle. But we're going to do, again, the two-step method, where we say, okay, the bicycle itself is $189.50. I need to add what I'm paying in tax on top of that. So we're going to set up a table. Oop, I did not make that one wide enough. That's okay. Sometimes I do that, where I just do not do the right dimensions at all. So I'm going to squeeze that in there. There's the start. And then we've got to add a tax onto it. Okay, and then we're going to end with our total. So we start with $189.50. Now I need to calculate what is the tax. Okay, so what is the tax? Well, it's 5%. So again, I can set up a proportion to do this if I'd like. I can set up 5% of $189.50. We set up the proportion like that. Remember, this is our part, whole, percent, 100. When we cross multiply and divide, we get 9.475, which comes out to 948. Remember, the other option is I can say, well, I'm trying to find 5%, so I write 5% as a decimal, times the original value, which is $189.50. So 5% times $189.50 comes out to the exact same number, which is $9.48. So I need $9.48 in tax. So when I add those two together, how much am I actually going to pay for this bicycle? Well, I'm going to pay $198.98. Now remember, this goes to the store, this goes to the government, and this is how much I'm paying total. So what if we want to find a tip? Okay, same process. Our food costs $35. We have a 15% tip. We're going to go ahead and draw our little table. And again, this is just to help you visualize. You don't 100% need this all the time, but it's really helpful to just visualize. We're going to call this our subtotal. That's the other word that we call when we call the amount that we got before tax, tip, discount, anything like that. That's our subtotal, and we know that was $35. Okay, and then in this case we're going to add a tip, and we must be in Montana, so we don't have a sales tax, so we're just going to add the tip. And so in the end, we're going to be able to figure out what is our total amount. So our subtotal is here, we add the tip, and that gives our total amount. So again, we're going to calculate what our tip is. I'm trying to find 15% of $35. So I can remember that 15% is written as a decimal, 0.15 times 35. Okay, and when I multiply those two together, I get 525. So how much am I going to pay altogether? Well, I add 35 and 525, and I get 40.25. But see how this is helpful, because you can see this is how much the restaurant gets, this is how much the waitress gets, and this is how much you pay altogether. Okay, what if I have something that is $52 to begin with, and I'm going to get a discount on it? All right, well, we're going to draw our table and see if I can finally remember to draw it wide enough this time. Okay, so we're going to take a discount on this. So, remember, this is our subtotal. Then we're going to subtract a discount, which is going to give us our total. Okay, and so I like to write that, subtract the discount, so that I can just remember. I'm taking the subtotal, I'm subtracting out the discount. What is the final amount? Okay, so $52 is my subtotal. Now the discount is 20% of the original. So again, 0.02, you could think of it as 0.020, but remember we don't actually need that additional 0, times my original amount is going to give me my discount amount. So if I did that in my calculator, 0.2 times 52, I get 1040. Okay, and then all I have to do is remember this is subtracting that because it's a discount, so I end up with 41.60. Okay, what if I want to do a tax and a tip? Ooh, okay, so my food is going to be $75. I'm going to put a 6% tax on that and a 20% tip. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what number do we tax on? Well, we apply our tax to the final bill, right? So we don't do the tax after the tip. We do it from whatever our food bill was, right? And then we're going to ask ourselves, what do we tip on? Same thing, right? We tip on the final bill for the food, not the tax as well, right? We tip only on this $75. Okay, so we're going to look at our subtotal was $75. Okay, we're going to have to add a tax. We're going to also, we'll do it, add a tip, and then we're going to find our total. Okay, so our tax, we need 6% of our food bill, which is $75. So, remember, we write 6% as 0.06 times $75, which gives us $4.50. So we're going to add $4.50 for tax. Okay, what about a tip? Well, if I'm looking at 20% tip, again, I'm going to write 20%, 0.02, or 0.2, excuse me, times 75, and that gives me $15. So my tip is going to be $15. And again, that one's added in. So all I do is add those three together, because I know that subtotal is what I pay for the food, this is how much the government gets to keep, and this is how much the waitress gets to keep. So when I add it all together, I get $94.50. All right, let's look at one more that also has a discount. Okay, this one gets a little bit hairy because we don't actually do both of them off of $35. And what I mean is we've got food of $35, we have a tax of 7.6%, we have a discount of 15%. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we do first? Well, if I get a discount on something and they mark it down $10, I don't have to pay taxes on the $10 they took off, right? I only have to pay taxes on the amount after the discount. So in this case, we're going to need to draw a table, and we're going to have to figure out a little bit more because we need to have, so we're going to start with our food, our total food, and then we need to figure out what is our discount, and so we'll subtract that out. Then we need to figure out our tax on that amount. So let's do a total of 5 rows on this one. So when you have something like this, we start with our food. We have to take the discount off first, and then we have to figure out what is the price after the discount, because that is the price we're going to be taxing. Okay, so I just gave some little things here to help us kind of move down the list. So we start with our subtotal. We're going to calculate the discount off of that. So we start with $35, okay? Our discount comes off of $35. So we can say, what is 15% of $35? That is $5.25. Okay, so we know we're going to subtract $5.25. Okay, so again, this is where it gets a little tricky, because we can't just add the tax because we don't know what number we're actually paying tax on, because again, remember, we're not paying tax on the 35. We would pay a tip on the 35, but we would not pay a tax on 35. We only pay tax on the discounted amount. So we need to take our $35 and subtract $5.25 from it, and after the discount, we actually only are going to pay $29.75. That's the amount that we actually get taxed on. We only have to pay taxes on this amount. So now we have to figure out what's our tax. Well, our tax is 7.6%, so we need to write 7.6 as a decimal. Remember, that moves the decimal place twice, so it would be 0.076 times. And now, again, we're taxing this amount. We're trying to figure out what is our taxes on $29.75. Well, let's see. $29.75 times 0.076 is going to give us $2.261. And remember, since we're doing money, that would just be $2.26. So it gives us $2.26. How much is that total? $32.01. So the key takeaway here is that we do not pay tax on the discounted amount. So if we have a discount and a tax, we only pay taxes on the amount after the discount. However, if we had a discount and a tip, we would pay a tip on the original amount. So let's look at one that has all three. So let's say we have a bill of $135. We're going to have a tax of 8.2%. We're going to have a tip of 20% and a discount of 25%. So we just have to really start thinking about what are we going to do. So before I even draw my table, I'm just going to think about this. Okay, so this is my subtotal. That's how much it is for all of the food. So I'm going to draw my table around this after I kind of decide. Now, let's see. Let's start with the discount first, because remember, we don't pay taxes on the amount after the discount. So let's say minus the discount. Okay, and then, oh, maybe I should have made that bigger. That's fine. And then, so this is going to be our amount after the discount. Okay. Then we're going to add in tax, because our tax is off of this number after the discount. Okay, and then we're also going to add in a tip, and this one's going to get a little bit tricky because our tip, we're going to tip off of the original amount and not any of these other numbers we have in here. Okay, so then we can finalize here with our total. All right, give me a minute. I will draw. All right, I should probably thought that through because it's definitely a little tight in there, but that's okay. So we start with $135. Okay, so we're going to take a discount of 25% on that amount. So a discount of 25% would be 0.25 times 135, and so that would be $33.75. So you're going to save $33.75 on your discount. So when we take 135 and we subtract $33.75, we're actually only paying $101.25 after that discount. And so now we're going to only pay tax on this amount, remember, because this is, we don't pay taxes on a discount. So we're going to pay taxes on that, and our tax rate is 88.2%, so 0.82. Okay, we're going to multiply that by 101.25. Okay. So we actually pay, that comes out to 8.3025. Since this is money, we go to here, it doesn't round up, so that's $8.30. Okay, now here's the tricky one, the tip. Now we have to figure out, how do I calculate the tip? What number do I use to calculate the tip? Well, remember, it's not fair to the server for you to only tip on the discounted amount, because they did the work of a $135 meal. So we are going to tip on the original $135. So we're going to give a 20% tip on $135. Okay, so 20% times 135, that's $27. Okay, so we took the discount and we got to here. We did our math up through there. Now we need to add in our $8.30 tax and our $27 tip, and our total final price, wrong color, is $136.55. So that discount really helped you out. Okay, there you go. So that's what you have to remember, is that taxes come after a discount. Tips come before a discount. And we're going to look at some examples also where sometimes there are certain things you don't pay tax on, and sometimes there are certain things you don't pay a tip on. So you always just have to take into account, what amount am I actually taxing or tipping. The other thing I want you to look at really quick is just to think about this in terms of a little bit of like equation work here. So in one of our examples, we had a 15% tip. So if I had a 15% tip, what we did is we said, well, that's 35 plus 525. We calculated that like right here, right? What I want you to think about is we took 35 and we added 525 to it. So we can think about this, if you think about that 100% of it was 35, okay, then we added 15% of it, which was 0.15 times 35. Remember, that's how we find 15% of a number. And that equals our 40.25. So this equation kind of represents what we did. It actually equals 115% of 35. And when you look at these equations, you can kind of think about this in those other equations that we talked about. This is the same. Look, this is 100% and 15%. So you could also think about this as 115% times 35. And that would give you the same amount, because see, this is 100% and this is 15%. Either way, it works out. You can do this either way, but I want you to recognize that both of those equations are the same thing.